thank you very much for having me. I'm super excited, and thank you for Heather for introducing me as an alumni. So I actually graduated, thank goodness, and hopefully some of you know what that's like. It was really good. I love being able to follow Seth. You know, he was able to really talk about two of the countries that are important and in the news right now, Russia and China. I'm going to dive in a little bit more just on the Russia portion, and specifically on election security, which has been my passion since 2016. You're probably wondering why is this relevant for me right now? And what I can say is a recent Monmouth University poll from last year showed that 32% of Americans still think that the election was rigged so that President Biden is in office right now. And where is that 30% of Americans who still think that? The reason for that, I would argue, is disinformation that probably started in the 2016 elections. I would say before the 2016 elections, none of us even thought about voter fraud or any of these other things. But I really want to dive a little bit deeper into why I think it's really important that we learn from the 2020 elections as we move into the 2024 cycle. So, pop quiz for today. What do these 4 photos have in common? I think the easy thing is they're all men. I think we can all agree on that, or at least they are perceived as men. What I will also say, and you may not know this, is all 4 of them are Russian trolls. So I think the one in your upper right-hand corner, you can tell, right? That's Vladimir Putin. He's been in the news pretty much every day for what's going on in eastern Ukraine right now. I would argue he is the king of all of the trolls, of the Russian trolls. Right next to him in his uniform is actually one of the deputies for General Gerasimov that Seth had mentioned. So his name is Andrei Kartopolov. He was formerly the Deputy Minister of Defense, also right-hand man for Gerasimov. He is actually in the Duma right now, so he's a politician in the Congress. I would say he is actually the mastermind of the trolls. So he was the one who came up with what they call new type warfare, and what Seth and I will also refer to as hybrid warfare. So that's actually one of the main things that we've seen in 2016. I think we can all agree that there was hybrid warfare going on, the hack of the Democratic National Committee, all of the influence campaigns that were being brought about by the man with a grumpy face. So for those of you who don't recognize him, his name is Yevgeny Prigozhin. He is one of the Russian oligarchs, also known colloquially as Putin's chef, right? So Putin and him, they each met each other and became buddies when Putin was the mayor of St. Petersburg, and Prigozhin owned a chain of hot dog stands, if you can believe that. Prigozhin is now a multi-billionaire who runs a conglomerate called Concord Management, and then one of the companies that he owns in Concord Management is called the Internet Research Agency, which I think you are all familiar with as of 2016. But last but not least, who is this guy who doesn't really look like the other guys? His name is Seth Werdu, and he is a Russian troll based in Ghana. And so I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into how the Russians have changed their tactics since 2016. I'm also going to talk about how both the social media companies and the US government have had to adjust our tactics to counter the measures from the Russians. And then lastly, based on this analysis, I'm going to share with you some recommendations that I have to help protect the 2024 elections. So I already mentioned the Internet Research Agency, right? So they're under Yevgeny Prigozhin. This is an actual company. So just think of this as a public relations firm based in St. Petersburg, Russia right now. They are active. They have shifts of people working every day, working on the PR on behalf of Russia, right? So I think you're all familiar that in 2016, all of these trolls were all over the social media platforms, primarily Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. So you had people not just working 8 to 5, but working 24 hours a day, putting out false information, amplifying existing information, and just in general causing a lot of discord. So the shift that we've seen ahead of the 2020 elections is threefold. Number one is Seth Werdu, right? I think that's a little bit better picture that we have of him. So who is Seth Werdu? Seth Werdu runs a company called Eliminating Barriers for the Liberation of Africa. So this is a false flag operation that is bankrolled by Yevgeny Prigozhin. They opened offices in both Accra in Ghana and in Lagos, Nigeria. They had offices in both of these countries where all they did every day was troll farm activity. They hired local people who could speak and write English, and all of these people, what they did was they were on Facebook, they were on YouTube, and they were on Twitter, and guess who they were targeting? They were targeting African Americans here in the United States. They were fanning the flames to try to suppress the vote, try to get them, hey, your vote's not going to count anyway. Why would you even want to come out here? So that's one of the shifts we saw was not only is there troll farm activity in Russia, they've shifted to Africa. And you're probably wondering why. And if you remember from Seth's slide, there is a large Russian presence in different countries in Africa, right? A large military presence, but guess what? There is also a large private sector presence. And anywhere that Yevgeny Prigozhin, Putin's chef, he would roll his conglomerate in. They would provide food services to all of these different countries. And I think Seth alluded to a private security. Well, guess what? Prigozhin runs a Blackwater type firm called Wagner Security. And lots of these different despotic African countries have hired them. So wherever you see Prigozhin, there's potential to see Russian troll activities as well. The next thing that we saw the Russians do was they weren't just focused on disinformation on the social media platforms. They wanted to make their own websites so that they could control the narrative better, right? So if you look at the bottom corner, you see NAEBC. That's the Newsroom for American and European-based Citizens. This was a fake website portraying a news media outlet put on by the Internet Research Agency. And they were really trying to do conservative type issues. They went to Upwork and they hired freelance writers to write on conservative issues, gun rights and white nationalist style information. There was also another website, and I don't have it on this slide, called Peace Data, which was the progressive liberal version of that, right? Talking about Black Lives Matter, talking about women's rights, talking about pro-choice, pro-abortion type rhetoric. And they also hired a bunch of freelance journalists to write both of these. So the good news is the US government was able to figure this out and out them and work with the companies to out them, but we're gonna talk about that a little later. And if you see these three profile pictures, they look like real people, don't they? This was our first example of deep fakes. Everybody, including myself, was really worried about deep fakes coming from the Russians. And so none of these are real people, but these were the profile photos that were used in both the NAEBC website as well as the Peace Data website. So this was a very small but effective use because it made all of these look like, hey, these are real people populating, not just a bunch of photos that people grab from other people's Instagram feeds. So this is what the Russians and the Internet Research Agency specifically did ahead of the 2020 elections. So now I want to focus on what the heck did the social media companies do? I think we can all agree that in 2016 they did nothing, right? And I think Mark Zuckerberg had a quote early on like, I don't think anything could have happened on any of our platforms, right? So the good news is they actually did three key things to help counter Russian disinformation ahead of 2020. Number one was they actually realized that they were on their platforms. So all of those algorithms that are trying to sell you ads and all of these other things, they were actually used to detect Russian troll activity and knock them out. So this was a good thing. They actually did a better job of finding where the Russian trolls were, disabling their accounts, knocking down their content, and they actually posted transparency reports to share that information. The second thing that they did was they realized that in and of themselves, they couldn't handle all of it. So they partnered with outside reputable organizations to continue looking for Russian trolls. So reputable organizations like the Stanford University Internet Observatory or Oxford's Internet Institute, and also a private research company called Graphica. So they were able to partner with all of these different organizations to figure out where the Russian troll activity was, and then whenever they saw it on their platform, they were able to knock it out, and all of those organizations were able to push out reports ahead of the 2020 elections in order to let the American public know, hey, there's a bunch of Russian troll activity going on. And then last but not least, and I think you know why I'm here, is I work at the FBI. There was a lot more information sharing between the US government and these social media companies. And you can tell because there was actually statements put out in different news articles, in different press statements where, like, for example, Google said, based on information provided to us by the FBI, we were able to detect and take down this Russian troll activity. Also, in some statements which were put out by the US government, specifically the Department of Justice, we actually acknowledged sharing information with these social media companies and receiving information in return. I can let you know there was a lot more going on than what was just shown in the press, but at least there was some public acknowledgement of that. So I think that's a good segue to talk about what the US government actually did ahead of this time. I'm just going to focus on the three things. Number one, I've already talked to you about, right? Sharing information between the US government, all of the three-letter agencies, as well as other partners, international partners, with the social media companies. That was number one. Number two, what the FBI did better this time as opposed to in 2016 was we provided defensive cybersecurity briefings to all of the major presidential candidates. I think there's 23 identified presidential candidates. We provided cybersecurity briefings to all of them. We provided cybersecurity assessments to them so that we would not have another Hillary Clinton / DNC 2016 style hack and leak situation. And I can proudly say, if you guys reflect on what 2020 looked like, no really embarrassing hack and leak operations happened. And I would say that the initiative that the FBI did played a small part in that. The next thing that happened that the US government that did really well, and I see a couple of my CISA colleagues up here, is the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency worked really well with all of the secretaries of state for every state to make sure that they all of their actual election infrastructure, the polling equipment, the polling stations, all of the communications were as safe as could be. I know they provided federal grants to help people update all of that. I think this combination of things really helped to ensure that the 2020 elections, and I will quote Chris Krebs, former CISA director, was the most secure in US history. So, what are we going to learn from this? I have three recommendations that I want to share with you. Number one is I talked about information sharing. I think, from firsthand experience, it was very ad hoc. And so what I think we need to do is formalize it in the form of an Information Sharing and Analysis Center, an ISAC. I think all of you are familiar with MS-ISAC, right? Multi-state ISAC. Another awesome ISAC that I work with frequently is the FS-ISAC, the Financial Sector ISAC. And so being able to share information in real time would be really good. I think we need something like a social media company ISAC. We don't have one right now. What they tell me is that there's too much rivalry and competition going on, but come on, there's an FS-ISAC. You can't tell me that Citibank and JP Morgan and Bank of America, they don't all love each other, right? They're all trying to take each other's customers. However, at the end of the day, being able to share threat intelligence is really important. The second thing, and it's already been approved by Congress, is I think we need a national center for being able to discuss and share information on countering information operations. So this was authorized in the 2020 National Defense Authorization Act. Congress actually said, hey, we want the Office of the Director of National Intelligence to stand up this center. And we want it to be kind of like in the style of the National Counterterrorism Center, except the difference is actually having private sector representatives sitting at a center where you could share information real time between the US government and private sector. And then last but not least, and I think this is probably going to be the toughest one, is media literacy. So I told Heather I have 2 daughters in high school right now, and one of the things that they're going through is they need to be able to find accurate and reliable sources whenever they're writing papers. So I think students are inculcated right now with how to look for good information. However, when we become adults, and especially when we have Uncle Bob or Aunt Sally, they tend to fall for information that is not quite accurate or real. What I would say is that we need to come up with methods for being able to educate adults. We've already gotten some really good, but maybe not as widespread programs. One is called Harmony Square. University of Cambridge made this game to help people detect disinformation. Another thing put out by my CISA colleagues again was the War on Pineapple. I don't know if any of you guys remember this was a campaign ahead of the 2020 elections, but the War on Pineapple went through the stages of disinformation and helped people to detect it. What I would argue is we need to put both of these types of things on steroids. We need to work with the private sector, get out more public service announcements. I would also say for the seniors in our lives, doing this type of partnership with the AARP and other types of senior organizations would go a long way to helping inoculate us for the next election cycle. And that's all I have, and I will open it up for questions now. Thank you.
So you talked about the MSISAC and the FSISAC. What was the FBI's connection to the EIISAC?
So with the EIISAC, we had detailees who met regularly with, so the EIISAC is the Election Infrastructure ISAC. So I was actually on monthly calls with the EIISAC, and I know that my FBI counterparts, because there were different EIISAC representatives all around the United States, the relevant field offices, the relevant FBI field offices had at least monthly syncs with their counterparts at EIISAC. Good question.
Let's we had a question here on chat. How do we balance the right of privacy and free speech and the need to detect and identify those who are working with Russian trolls, bad actors, etc., that are hiding behind free speech to push false messages, fake news, etc.?
That is an awesome question. So how do we balance free speech and knocking out disinformation? So the First Amendment, and I think, I'm talking to a sympathetic audience, only applies to government impedance of free speech, right? So the government is not allowed to impede your free speech. However, what we're actually talking about is private companies allowing users to discuss things, right? And so I think there's a big difference in that. Where we, the US government, can work well with the private sector is around their community standards or their terms of service, right? So I think you will see that many prominent people have been knocked off websites because they have violated a company's terms of service, right? So they've said horrible things, they've tried to elicit violence, or other things like that, where I would say is being able to provide guardrails to companies is always a good thing. However, at the end of the day, these are private entities. Some of them are publicly traded, but I definitely think that we need to clarify First Amendment only applies to use and to you when you're working on a public forum, right? Like if you're sitting in the town square and you can say whatever the heck you want, right? However, I know Facebook wants to say they're the town square, but they're not. They're a privately owned entity, and they get to decide what kind of content they want. I think from that, what we've seen in a free market society like we have is you have now seen conservative social media platforms popping up, and I think that's a great thing because we need more avenues for speech. However, I do think that there should be certain standards that we adhere to, and I think the conservative social media platforms are finding out, hey, we don't want to have any standards, but the problem is if you don't have any standards, then it all goes down to the 4chan level very quickly.
Thank you, great presentation.
Thank you.
So given that there are over 10 million nonprofits or NGOs globally, as a private donor or as a government entity, how do we find out which organizations are accurate and worth investing in? They could be a front for one of these, social media scams.
That is an awesome question. So she said there's a lot of nonprofit organizations or non-governmental organizations who are looking at this, looking at disinformation, right? And so I think you're absolutely right. If you're a small NGO trying to break it big and, hey, we're in the disinformation space now, I hate to say it, but there's a certain level of brand recognition, right? When I mentioned Stanford University or I mentioned the University of Cambridge, there's already a cachet that's involved with them. So I do think that at the end of the day, I know that these organizations have cachet, but you'd never heard of Graphica. I'd never heard of Graphica. What they've done is they've looked at data, right? And so whatever data they can get from the social media companies, like a Twitter or other social media companies that provide data, being able to share that transparency. Like if you're an NGO trying to get into the disinformation space, say, this was the data set that I looked at, this was the analysis that we used, and this is why we think we're right? So I would say, in a university setting like this one, having peer-reviewed research papers is definitely the way to go. And not a peer review where it's, just you and Uncle Bob and Aunt Sally looking at it, but having, people from different organizations, different academic institutes being able to review the information and look at your analysis. I think that's the way of the future. Good question.
Appreciate you speaking. Question, so much of elections are conducted at the local level. Do you have any recommendations for both sides, the government side as well as the local elections directors for countering this in the future?
Yeah, so I know there's a lot of local and county and state level election officials here. So at the end of the day, what I say to all of you is, I know you can't do it alone, right? So guess what? Your federal tax dollars are paying for your local FBI field office, as well as Department of Homeland Security, CISA, to come out and help you, right? If you are at a small county, and in San Francisco's division, we have 15 counties in our division, and a lot of them are very small counties without a lot of resources. We, here at least in FBI San Francisco, have quarterly calls with them ahead of elections, but that's a good time to say, hey, Elvis, we're in Butte County, or we're in Shasta County, and we could really use some help here. Then it's as easy as a phone call, and I know the CISA reps would feel the same way. It's like, hey, you want to send us an email? We can come do a site assessment for you. We can come at least provide a briefing to your polling workers, things like that. These are all things where there are resources. I just think a lot of the smaller municipalities and counties are not aware of them. But I'm here to let you know, we are, we're with the government and we are here to help.
Elvis, we had a question on Zoom. If the government is advising private sector on what the standards are, that could be a First Amendment issue. Canceling and banning for violations of a government-influenced term of service has not helped to unite the nation. How can the government influence without crossing that line?
Man, that is a fantastic question. And I've sat in on some ELP cohorts where we've had this exact discussion. I think there are certain red lines that, I know it didn't work well for the Obama administration, but child sex trafficking, child exploitation, that's a red line I think we can all get behind, right? But beyond that, there's a lot of gray involved, right? So Section 230, right, of the Communications Decency Act, there is a lot of discussion about modifying that and what would that look like. Right? So I do think that there has to be a balance where the government should be there just for the big guardrails, right? So if I said setting standards, I meant the grossly large guardrails, but I would say that companies working with the regulators, who are also government agencies, right, should figure out what those guardrails look like for whatever sector that they are in, right? So I don't want it to be government just laying down the law. I want there to be a discussion, right? Whenever you have government making new cybersecurity standards, right, everyone gets really hacked off about that. But I would say working together, guardrails by the government, very large. However, working in collaboration with each of the industries to figure out where do they think is acceptable, and then putting those into regulations and policies.